Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Harlan Creek, nestled between two barren hills and forgotten fields, was not the kind of place one chose for a vacation. Or even for a detour. The rusty signs at the town's entrance seemed to beg forgiveness for existing, and the dust kicked up by the few vehicles formed a beige haze that seemed eternal. The houses there were modest, often wooden, with sloping roofs and creaky porches. There were old abandoned swing sets, bicycles without wheels, stray dogs that we all knew by their first names. The pickup trucks were older than their drivers, and morning coffee was always served at their Moose Diner, where time stood still in 1983. There wasn't much, a station service run by a former Marine turned amateur philosopher, Asmal Hospital half empty, one Baptist church where Pastor James preached as much about God as about common sense, an ailed grocery store in red brick, held by Maggie Thompson. Maggie, 72, had lived here her whole life. She knew everyone by name, remembered their children's birthdays, and gave them Halloween candy even if they were 20. Since the death of her husband, Sheriff Ben Thompson, she had continued to open the shop every morning at 6:30 a.m., like a sacred ritual. Her voice was soft, her smile genuine, and no one ever refused her cornbread. But in recent months, something had changed in Harlan Creek. A shadow had crept between the old buildings and the dirt roads. A gang of young delinquents from Rapid City, a town about 100 kilometers away, had begun to impose its law in this quiet corner. They thought they were invincible. Troy Harris, the leader, was a cunning boy, with a piercing gaze and a dull hatred of all forms of authority. Jackson Reed, he had his hands always trembling, a rage contained in a thin and nervous body. And Leo Carter, the cruelest, seemed to take an unhealthy pleasure in humiliating, hurting, and dirtying. They had settled in an old abandoned house on the edge of Route 17, and since then, fear had slowly settled into the eyes of the inhabitants. They stole shamelessly, pushed elders, sprayed obscene graffiti on the church walls, and threw stones at neighbors' dogs. They demanded a right-of-way from shopkeepers and threatened those who refused. The local sheriff, overwhelmed and fearful, often turned a blind eye. The residents, on the other hand, bowed their heads. Out of fear. Out of habit. More Elias Walker, he never lowered his head. He lived in an old wooden hut, hidden in the fir trees at the northern edge of town, near an old hunting camp. His house didn't have electricity every day, and his yard hadn't been mowed in years. He lived alone, in an almost religious silence. The rare times he was seen, it was to buy black coffee, stale bread, or some old, worn novels that he read under the light of an oil lamp. He always wore a long brown coat, with a hole in his neck, a tired hat pulled down over his forehead, and he was using a carved wooden cane. His face was marked, wrinkled by age, the wind, and perhaps other wars. He didn't speak to anyone. He watched. He listened. He observed. The children nicknamed him, the Old Ghost, because of his silent gait and brief appearances. It was said that he had once killed a bear with his bare hands, that he had lived in the mountains, or even that he spoke to wolves. Children's stories, but always told with a mixture of laughter and fear. What no one knew, what no one could imagine, is that this discreet, solitary, and tired man, had once been a legend in the shadows. Elias Shade Walker, a former elite clandestine operative, a silent killer for operations the government wouldn't even acknowledge on paper. He'd seen the world burn. He'd ended wars, or helped start them. He'd disappeared after a top-secret mission in Pakistan. Officially, dead. Buried. But in reality, he had gone into exile in Harlan Creek, not to hide from others, but for to escape what he had become. This Tuesday afternoon, the sun was beating down hard on the old front of the grocery store. Thompson's General Store. Maggie, broom in hand, swept up the dead leaves and dust carried by the wind. She hummed softly an old Patsy Cline tune, the same one she had been singing since her husband died. The doorbells jingled occasionally, greeting a customer or two, an old man who came for his cigarettes, a mother for milk and bread. Then the bell rang once too often. When Maggie looked up, her smile faded. Troy Harris, Jackson Reed, and Leo Carter had just burst in. None of them were wearing masks. They didn't even need to hide anymore. Their mere presence was enough to silence the street. "Maggie, still standing at your age, huh?" Troy said with his eternal grin. She straightened up, planted her broom like a baton of command, and faced them. Despite her wrinkles and small stature, she exuded a firm, almost ancestral dignity. "I already told you that I will not give in to your threats," she replied. Troy shrugged as if he expected that answer. "You're going to learn, Grandma. You're going to learn like the others." Then, with a brutal swing of his arm, he knocked over the old cash register metal. It fell with a dull clatter, scattering bills and coins like dead leaves. Jackson burst out laughing, then began to jostle the shelves, knocking over cans, trampling vegetables on the floor. Leo, however, wasn't laughing. His gaze was blank, almost mechanical, as if violence had become automatic. He approached Maggie slowly and grabbed her by the collar of his knitted wool sweater. His breath smelled of cheap alcohol and hatred. "Did you hear? You pay. Or we'll come back every week. And next time, it won't just be your car that gets broken." She tried to push him away, but her hands were shaking. And it ice at this precise moment that a figure appeared in the doorway. Elias Walker. There was no bell ringing. No word spoken. Just a presence. The air seemed to become denser. He entered slowly, like a man who had nothing to prove, each step calculated, silent, but with a heavy intensity. His long brown coat brushed the ground, and his wooden cane tapped gently against the floorboards. He stopped a few steps from the stage. He didn't shout. He didn't insult anyone. He observed. His gaze moved from one face to the next. Then he settled on Maggie. His eyes lingered a second longer on the wrinkled collar of her sweater, on Leo's clenched fingers, on the scattered bills on the floor. He analyzed everything. Every angle. Every breath. "What, dinosaur?" Troy snorted. "You want us to help you find your retirement home?" The other two burst out laughing. Even Maggie, on the verge of tears, turned her head toward Elias, as if to say, "Go away, don't get involved in this." But Elias approached the counter slowly. His step was calm, fluid, silent, almost ominous. He placed his cane against the wall, with deliberate slowness. His trembling hands unbuttoned his coat, one button at a time. And finally, he looked up at Leo. Her voice, when she came out, was low. "Rough. Tired. Put down the knife, Leo." An icy silence fell over the shop. Leo's eyes widened. He hadn't taken out his knife, not yet, but he had it on him, in his belt. How could this old man know? "What did you say, old man?" Jackson growled, frowning. Elias did not answer. He just looked up, and it was as if the room had shifted into another dimension. His gaze was no longer tired or old. It was a steely gaze. A gaze without emotion. Without hesitation. Not that of an old man. But the one of a predator. One of those looks you only see in the last moments, just before death strikes. Troy instinctively took a half step back. Leo loosened his grip on Maggie slightly. Jackson felt a cold sweat break out under his jacket. They had no idea who stood before them. More their instinct knew, they had just awakened something that should have remained buried. Something dangerous. Something irremediable. What followed lasted only a few seconds, but each second seemed to stretch into eternity. Even the security cameras, more accustomed to filming candy thieves or arguments between customers, only captured sudden blurs, shadows crossing the frame, sharp noises followed by shouts. It was so quick, so surgical, that even a trained eye would have struggled to understand what it was seeing. It all started when Jackson, the most nervous, driven by wounded pride and a desire for domination, brandishes a bat baseball in aluminum that he had hidden under his jacket. He yelled a war cry, more to reassure himself than to impress, and charged at Elias. more Elijah, didn't move. He waited until the bat was inches from his face, then, in a lightning movement, he pivoted to the side, grabbed Jackson's wrist with a precise, almost delicate gesture, and turned him around with controlled brutality. And dry crackler sounds. Jackson's arm formed a grotesque, disjointed curve. He screamed in pain, dropped his weapon, and collapsed to the tile floor, clutching his shattered limb like a wounded animal. Troy, stunned, took a second too long to react. He lunged forward, his fist raised, ready to strike blindly. But Elias had already anticipated his movement. He took a step back, pivoted 3/4, then hit the hollow of his throat with the edge of his hand, exactly between the Adam's apple and the sternum. Not enough to kill. Just enough to take your breath away. Troy collapsed, coughing, choking, clutching his throat as if he'd been drowned. The silence was broken by a metallic click. Leo, the impulsive one, finally brought out what Elias had felt from the beginning, a folding knife, black, shining under the neon light. He lunged forward, blade forward, ready to stab. But he didn't even have time to blink. Elias leaped, like a feline. He grabbed the armed wrist in full motion, applied such sudden pressure that Leo's fingers opened of their own accord, releasing the knife. With a pivot, he disarmed him. With a second move, he used Leo's momentum against himself and threw him violently against the cereal shelf. Boxes of cornflakes exploded in a cloud of sugary dust. 3 movements, not one more. And suddenly, everything was silence. The 3 young men lay on the ground. One was groaning, his arm twisted. Another was choking, his eyes wide open. The last, stunned, barely moved. There was no blood, no war cries, no gratuitous brutality. Just a demonstration of absolute mastery. And all this had lasted 11 seconds. Elias slowly picked up his coat and placed it methodically on his shoulders, as if he were putting on a mask. Then he resumed his cane, placed near the counter, and turned towards Maggie, frozen behind her overturned crate. Her hands were shaking. Her lips murmured a prayer, or perhaps her own name, as if to reassure herself that she was still alive. Her gaze met Elias's, unable to meet his. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice deep but surprisingly gentle. She nodded, unable to answer. Tears were beginning to well up in her eyes. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Finally, she stammered. Who are you?" Elias remained silent for a moment. Then, with a look that seemed to reach far back in time, he replied. "Someone who tried to forget what he was." He looked at her for a moment longer, as if to make sure she was safe. Then he turned away. And left again without looking back, his step slow but resolute, as if this scene had been only an ancient echo in a life he had tried to bury. Sheriff Reggie Doyle arrived on the scene about 20 minutes after a witness's panicked call. He'd expected a routine brawl between young thugs. But when he stepped through the door of Thompson's grocery, the atmosphere struck him immediately: silence, tension, shifty stares. 3 young men, Troy, Jackson, and Leo, lay on the ground, painfully aware of their broken limbs, but even more broken inside. No insults, no threats, just pure fear, frozen in their eyes. Maggie was still shaking behind her counter, unable to explain what she had seen. He barely touched them," she whispered. "He was, like a silent demon. He moved like a shadow." Reggie had the 3 attackers taken into custody. Then he asked to see the security footage. What he saw chilled him. An elderly figure, a worn coat, a calm gesture, and in about 10 seconds, 3 young men were brought to the ground with surgical precision. No excess. No unnecessary blows. Every movement seemed designed to incapacitate without killing, to injure without destroying. It was art. Cold. Calculated. The work of a professional. The next day, Reggie returned to his office and launched a discreet search, using access he wasn't authorized to have. An old friend at the FBI owed him a favor. He sent him some documents, classified, eyes only. The name was on them, coded, hidden under several erased identities. Elias Shade Walker. Former Special Forces agent. Recruited at a young age for clandestine operations. He was officially never born, and never died. Missions in Eastern Europe, Africa, South America. Last reported, Kandahar, Afghanistan. Mission aborted. His entire unit wiped out. Except for him. Then, nothing. Silence. He had disappeared. Deliberately. Erased. Reggie sank back in his chair, gasping for air. Good God. He was not a marginal old man. It was a human weapon. A shadow that had chosen to withdraw. But why here? Why Harlan Creek? Why Maggie's grocery store? He gradually understood that this man wasn't looking for peace. He was fleeing the inner turmoil. The tumult of what he had done. He wasn't retreating. He was punishing himself. By living alone, with books, abandoned animals, and heavy silences. The three young men were transferred to a federal prison. No charges were needed against Elias, they hadn't filed a complaint. None of them dared to say their name. But all of them, upon arrival, repeated the same thing to the guards, the other inmates, and the psychologists. In Dakota, there's an old man. But he's not a man. He's a curse. And in Harlan Creek, without wanting it, Elias became a legend. He was sometimes seen walking along the side of the road, picking up a wounded bird, or helping a mute teenager repair his bicycle. He never spoke about himself. He told nothing. Even the children, who once called him, the old ghost, now whispered his nickname like a prayer. One evening, as the sun slowly set behind the hills, Reggie entered a small cafe. Elias was there, alone, a cup in front of him, an open book, Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Reggie sat down without asking permission. Why did you do that? Why intervene? Elias gently closed the book. He looked up. His irises, dull but lively, had the depth of a bottomless well. Because I was taught to kill, he said calmly. But no one taught me to look the other way in the face of injustice. He paused. I wanted them to be afraid. Not of me. But of what might become of them if they continued. Reggie nodded slowly. He understood. This man had known violence in its rawest form, and now he was trying to channel it, to transform it into something bearable. As Reggie left the cafe, he thought Elias wasn't looking for forgiveness. He didn't want it. But maybe deep down he was trying to protect others, from the man he had been. And in this small Dakota town, where nothing ever seemed to happen, the shadow of an old assassin continued to watch. In silence. In peace. Until the world calls again. 3 years had passed since the day Elias had put an end to the terror in Maggie's grocery store. 3 silent, discreet, almost invisible years, but filled with a fragile peace. Then one autumn morning, when the wind blew harder than usual, making the dead leaves dance on the dirt roads, Maggie became worried. Elias hadn't opened his door for 2 days. She knew the old lion too well not to sense that something was wrong. Without warning, she took the key he had once entrusted to her, a rare gesture of trust, and headed toward his cabin at the end of the wooded path. The trees bent in the breeze, the sky hung low, laden with heavy clouds. She gently opened the wooden door. The interior was dark, but familiar. The old, worn leather armchair, the lamp on the table, stacks of books scattered about. She patted inside, calling his name in a soft, almost trembling voice. Then she saw him. Sitting in his armchair, a half-open book on his knees, Elias was finally resting. His face, serene, bore the mark of ultimate fatigue, that of a man who had finally laid down his weapons. He seemed peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep after a long meditation. On the coffee table, placed under an old lamp, a letter was carefully placed. Maggie took it, her hands shaking, and read aloud, her voice breaking with emotion. To those who will read this. I never wanted to be a hero. I have done things I dare not admit. But that day, in your shop, I finally had the chance to do something right. Thank you for allowing me to die as a man, not a shadow. Elias. The weight of those words fell on the room like an ancient breath. She felt tears fall, not only for this mysterious man, but for everything he had been, everything he had fled, everything he had silently offered her. On the day of the funeral, the small Baptist church in Harlan Creek was packed. The townspeople, their faces filled with respect and sadness, had come to pay tribute to this man who had chosen solitude over glory. Few words were spoken. The ceremony was simple, respectful. But everyone felt the grandeur hidden behind this humility. Sheriff Reggie Doyle, his eyes heavy, then stepped toward the coffin. He carefully placed a medal on the dark wood. A medal with no name, no clear insignia, just a simple black patch, the symbol of a shadowy fighter, invisible, unforgettable. Then Maggie, her voice trembling but firm, approached the microphone. He lived in silence, but he died like a giant. A murmur of agreement went through the assembly. In this sacred silence, everyone understood that it was not violence or death that defined a man, but the way he chose to live, and to leave. That day, under a low sky, as the first drops of rain began to fall, Harlan Creek lost its old ghost. But in the hearts of its inhabitants, he remained forever a giant.